His daughters were getting along well with each other. Lofton, Hathor, and Athena had formed a sort of trio, mostly bound through constant spars among themselves. Fulgrim had taken it upon herself to watch over Danu and Madonna, forming the second trio within the wider set. Lucem himself had decided to start taking his naps alongside Atalanta, the youngest, and thus, theoretically, most vulnerable. He was still reluctant to ever speak, except to ask about the next deployment, but this was a good start for the boy. He let his gaze roam the ruined courtyard. Limestone turned partially into slag and glass. Whatever symbols once here burned away, piles of melted autogun shots and scraps of destroyed equipment. But rarely were there any corpses, most of which burned away or scavenged, bones removed with precision. Piles of ash in corners where the whipping desert winds could not reach them. Athena spent much of her time with Danu and Fulgrim, speaking on matters of engineering and construction, a shared interest of the three. Lofton spent much of her time with Madonna, specifically to tease her in the way elder siblings ought to do with their younger ones, and in challenges of coming up with increasingly elaborate boasts and insults. Hathor did her best to make time for all of her sisters, Atalanta especially. Atalanta, of course, was still in her infancy and acted as infants usually did. Lucem spent all of his time slumbering, although now he slumbered near his sisters. He let his stride take him up and over the ruined tower, the crumbled stone of which served as an adequate walkway for him to go up to the next terrace of the fortress courtyard. Just as before, filled with scorch marks, slagged stonework, melted metal scraps, and symbols turned to ash. Bodies empty of bones and meat, just scraps of equipment. He breathed in deeply, tasting the scent that lingered in this place, the sunfire of certainty. Their studies were going well from last he heard from Aristocles. The sciences, technology, engineering, mathematics were all more than acceptable in pace, although some took to the core fields better than others. Language, histories, governance, warfare were in a similar situation, some of his daughters taking to the subjects better than others. Psychery was possibly their most disparate field, but it was still within acceptable parameters. Few of his daughters were particularly enthusiastic to learn, although each saw benefits in specific uses. Madonna took to those lessons with immense gusto, devouring all she could, only halted in certain fields by his specific and absolute warnings. Some things no man should delve into. Communion with the horrors was one subject that he would be gladdened to eradicate entirely. They were told that predators lurk in the warp, and that they should never attempt any action save their utter destruction. Not allies, not creatures to tame, parasites and predators. His comparison to the creatures that sucked on the souls of sorcerers on Prospero caused a grave look to come over Madonna's normally unreachable mask of confidence. His custodians and Psychana, moving in pairs, returned from their perimeter searches, each shaking their heads minutely in turn as they came within his gaze. His contemplative frown remained on his face as he considered the situation in full. This planet was Colchis. He had remembered reading articles of its discovery and colonization. Strange edifices scattered about a rather unremarkably bare planet, indications of ancient Xenos life, but little factual could be drawn up about their purpose. Last he remembered hearing about it was some time before the Machine Rebellion, and the information given to him by his supposed son told him little of particular concern. Information of what he knew of the world in the history line that he returned from. Not much save that it was eventually destroyed. Colchis wasn't quite destroyed, he thought, as he stepped over slag and ashes, but it could be in a generation or two. This was the last proper city on the planet. The rest of the inhabitants living in scattered tribes and nomadic clans, wandering about the planet from oasis to oasis. Considering the already barren natural wealth on the planet, and scraps of once functioning technologies now turned to ash, the people here were doomed to die on the planet without much hope of escaping into the void. His daughter, 17, primarch of the Imperial Heralds, was supposed to be on this planet. She was not. He supposed that this confirmed Malum's letter in part. He did claim that he intended to retrieve 17. He didn't say what he apparently decided to do to the population. The Emperor estimated that perhaps a third of the population was slain over the course of one day. He walked over to the origin point for a cone of slag on the stone ground before drawing his sword and going through the motions of a swing. He imagined a cone of flame coming from his blade, furrowed his brow, and bent his knees slightly. Not letting his arm fully extend, he mimed another swing. It didn't quite line up, but it was good enough for an estimate. 3 1/3 meters or so. His son was on the tall side, good for warring. He let his gaze trail to each spot of flame, not covering all the angles that defenders might fire down from. His son had a small ranger force with him, and judging from the ruined towers, at least one warwalker of some variant. Assuming he wasn't rotating his troops, that would be very few to conduct such a lengthy purge as this, especially with how soon each city was ruined after one another. Multiple ships, or rapid transportation, or both, in addition to a small force of highly elite warriors to accompany him. The occasional grooves and scratches in the stonework told him that many were mounted on some sort of clawed beast of roughly similar scale to a light tank. These were the Eldar, then? He did not know them to use clawed steeds, although perhaps the Exodites were different. His son was wielding a psychic flame similar to his own. He wondered how well he taught the boy, or if it was simply engineered into him. The sword scale was comparable. He furrowed his brow before adjusting his grip and swinging his sword again, wielding the blade as if it were larger than it was compared to his frame. This time the cone of slag lined up much better. It was not a similarly sized sword then. It was a near-perfect match, perhaps even the same blade. It was not his best work, certainly not a primary arm, but it was a perfectly serviceable sidearm. Perhaps he gave the blade to the boy as a gift. In the once future history, it would make sense. He turned his gaze and looked out of the courtyard towards what should have been a large port city. Only piles of rubble and dunes greeted his gaze. His probable son, wielding a similar sword to himself, took a small army of veteran soldiers mounted on clawed creatures and a warwalker with a blade, and had marched on each city on this world. Each one was carefully destroyed of any banners and insignias before being bombarded. This process was repeated for each and every major city along the waterways of the world, indicating rapid transports or multiple ships. No, his probable son was present at each. Rapid transport was required then. The more important question was why. He breathed in again, letting the nostalgic scent of sunfire ash fill his lungs once more, and exhaling. For some reason, his probable son decided that this world needed to be raised after retrieving 17. The number of possible reasons were endless. He had yet to take measure of the boy. He knew not how or what he thought. Malum Kaido indicated a particular personality, however. His probable son had decided that this world needed to be punished, possibly destroyed. The question was, does he trust the judgment? This world was still useful. Breathable atmosphere, abundant sea life, existing population, potential treasures in the city scraps, land to build upon. It was currently of very little use, however. Mostly barren waste and feudal populations, and now with utterly destroyed urban centers and no existing infrastructure of note. It would be a relatively expensive endeavor to bring this world to standards high enough to start effectively contributing to the wider imperium. Pragmatically, he lost little by writing off the loss of this world, but that would mean deciding to put conscious trust in the decision, the judgment of a man he had not met. This was not a matter of tax law. This was a declaration of worldwide death, a scouring, a lashing, a punishment from the void above. Even if it was pragmatic, writing this world off would mean endorsing a sentencing that he did not know the crime of, only the punishment. He let his gaze wander the horizon, the barren wastes and sands, the burning mirages and flickering air, the ash and slag of a scouring. In the ashes of 1,000,000 or more dead, he found his answer. Custodians, return to the Bucephalus and tell them to ready the virus bombardment. Psychana, return to your idler duties. The sentence of planetary execution came easily from his lips. I sentence the planet Colchis to exterminatus extremis. He would trust the justice of his probable son and finish the boy's work here. He could live with the sin, should this prove to be the incorrect decision. The boy had earned this much faith at least. Idly he made a note to check up on his daughters before they began preparations for another warp jump. He wouldn't be able to get off that blasted throne after they began, and it was a long ways to Barbarus. From the archaeotech cannons that lined the ribs of Bucephalus, Mightiest ship of the Imperium of mankind, a series of grand and terrible weapons issued forth. They launched without sound, for all is silent in the void, and approached the barren and ravaged world named Colchis. Reaching the atmosphere, the shells around the deadly payload began to burn up, ablating under the friction of re-entry and slowly beginning to enter onto their next stages of deployment. Soon, the shells had been sufficiently ablated to automatically deploy the second and third stage measures, slowing down the missiles gradually and bringing them to an almost gentle fall over the world. Once their internal cogitators had recorded that the missiles had been sufficiently slowed, it began to unleash the payload into the atmosphere. The Life-Eater virus was, in truth, barely a virus at all. It acted as such, certainly, propagating by digging into cell structures, devouring the innards, reproducing rapidly enough to burst out, carried by wind or water or land to the next host, and repeating the process. It performed all the expected functions of a deadly virus. It was, in truth, a weapon of the age of technology, one used to wipe planets clean of all previous life and leave a sea of ash in its wake. The Life-Eater virus propagated over Colchis, covering the scant life and immediately beginning this process. Organic matter, wherever it was found on the surface, quickly began to break down and dissolve into primordial matter, undifferentiated organic mass composed of naught but the stuff that composes cells. This breakdown of organic matter beginning to release a highly flammable gas byproduct, which rapidly began to take up a fraction of the world's atmosphere. With good winds, the virus can propagate over an entire world in less than an hour. A wave of foul air turning all living things into an ocean of destroyed cellular matter. With poor wind conditions, the virus may take a week to finish this process. The original missiles took measure of the winds left in the wake of their initial bombardment, tasting it, cogitators on board, estimating the fraction of air that was now composed of the gas byproduct. Once the atmosphere reached an acceptable threshold, the last stage of the weapon, stage 5, began. All missiles reaching consensus, a secondary weapon was enabled in their cores. Simple meltabombs. Promptly detonating, the missiles turned into brief bonfires of white-hot chemical flames. On their own, this would mean little. With the atmosphere now containing a large fraction of highly flammable byproduct for the semi-organic decay, these bonfires were merely the spark to light the pre-established chemical fuse. The byproduct was immensely hot when it started to burn, especially so when it was accumulated in great enough amounts. Hot enough indeed to begin a chain reaction in the other gases native to the atmospheres of all standard inhabitable worlds. From an initial bombardment of 1,000 scattered missiles over the surface of Colchis, a wave of burning sky washed forth. Not that any of the millions of inhabitants were alive still to see it at this point, reduced as they were to organic sea. A tidal wave of heat and pressure unlike any Colchis had witnessed prior, burning the highest layers of its oceans into steam. In time, that steam would form rain, which would begin the natural process of healing the planet afterwards. The planet now reduced to bare, nearly volcanic rock and seas. All but the deepest parts of the world were utterly consumed by the virus bombardment and then burned to ash, left to be washed away by rain. In ideal deployments of the weapon, the atmosphere was also ravaged to temporary uninhabitability. Rock and water were all that remained of Colchis after a period of 2 days. A successful virus bombardment was logged into the records of the Bucephalus. Ghosts swarmed Colchis, the now dead world. They covered it in the layer of immaterium, in the warp surround and covering materium, the shell of psychic awareness that encompassed all things. The ghosts crawled in the outer, most shallow layers of the psychic realm. One by one, these ghosts were dragged into the deeper warp, nothing for them to cling to in the shallows now that Colchis had been executed, pulled in by the writhing narratives and twisting songs from more distant worlds. A riptide of thought that brought spirits into swarming corals. These corals of warp were inhabited by predators. Swarming creatures of thought, energy, and narrative, stirred into a frenzy by the injection of so many fresh souls, and now eagerly devouring everything they came across. A bloodbath of ghosts and the things that dwelt in the warp just beyond the shallows. These warp predators were the least of all such things in the immaterium. They did not approach higher-order consumers and fled at the scent of such creatures in their presence, hoping to hide their existences beneath and behind long, ossified narratives and songs near to them. In the deeper warp, just beyond the corals, directly above Colchis, sat a higher-order entity, a fragment of something far grander and more terrible than what any mere warp predator could assume the forms of. Living maelstroms of thought energy and long fossilized narratives that encompass such vast swathes of the warp that they ceased to be entities and instead became part of the ocean itself. 4 grand seas that compose the immaterium ocean of the local galaxy, each an ecosystem in its own right, each propagating in the manner all life was bound to consume and grow. These seas were named the Chaos Gods. The entity was a fragment of one such god sea, a being that composed a small part of the greater whole, bound to and a part of its ecosystem, a daemon. The daemon was sitting in place, legs crossed in the manner of wise men, unbothered by the swirls of narratives about it and focused on the world below. Its body was of a smokeless flame, and 6 arms extended from it. One set of arms was clasped in prayer to its greater whole, one set gently pressing stray souls into wax seals and closing papyrus scrolls with their yoke, and the last set busy with quill in hand and recording what the 3 heads bore witness to. The heads looked in all 3 directions, each with 3 eyes and each face covered by a veil of silks and bronze. One face was young, one face mature, the last old, and over the heads was a halo of 60 fiery rods gently revolving about. About it were the winds of whispered truths and the scrolls of history unvarnished, and this was the domain the daemon brought about it. This daemon was a prince and a presence, one of the manifold clerks of the Lord of Change, who made it their business to record the fates of worlds. Currently, he was writing a special report on what had occurred here. Orders from a higher position in the bureaucracy of fate, one which he followed dutifully. A simple copy of his regular reporting. The scribe did his best to ignore the distant weeping, annoying creatures. He did not pause in his record-keeping, but his attention was caught by the approach of another entity in the warp, more than a mere warp predator, a coursing beast, bounding on 4 immense and thickly muscled legs, eyes that burned a smoky flame and claws that shed blood with their tread. The head of the beast was hairless, immense, and thickly muscled jaws filled with savage teeth and gently carrying a number of long bones. Behind the head was a crest of horn and frill which were tattered and frayed, and a thick pelt of metal hairs. One of the many messenger dogs of the Red God who ferried the words of commandment carved on bone on the behalf of daemon lords. Each pawprint brought with it a trail of brimstone and brass, and this was the domain the daemon brought with it. The beast raced up to the scribe, slowing in its bouncing pace as it neared, before stopping a distance away and sitting back on its laurels. Growling through the thin bones it delicately carried, the beast began to speak in the language of daemons, enuncia, scribe. The scribe acknowledged the beast with all appropriate courtesies. Carrier Hound, prince of coursing beasts of the line of Karanak. You are before a scribe of Zainch. On what business? The Carrier Hound exhaled, and fumes of burning air escaped its nostrils. A report of what occurred here. You will provide a copy to me. My lord demands it. Your lord is not my lord. The scribe spoke simply, not pausing in its duties, even as the Carrier Hound prepared to pounce and maul. But my lord has foreseen this. I inscribe the report as I speak. The Carrier Hound returned to its haunches, glaring balefully at the scribe as he worked. Lips drawn back over the thin bones, thin and delicate etchings of words could be seen covering their surface, part of the daemon's own duties. Hurry then, scribe. The hound snarled out, bloodlust restrained by duty alone. In the ambient wails of the warp, the 2 daemons sat, one in furious waiting, the other in deliberate and articulate record-keeping. The weeping grew closer, and both daemons reacted. The Carrier Hound in another snarl of fury, and the scribe in faintest hopes that the particular fate it was foreseeing did not come to pass. But the fate did come to pass, and it was a most unfortunate one. A form of living flesh and flora came stumbling up to the 2 daemons present. Like all of its kind, it was plump and sodden and wretched to behold. Hair fell down as damp vines and branches, crowned by a vibrant and blooming garland. Eyes were watery and narrowed in sorrow, and tears trailed down her face. A black dress clung to her form, wet with blood and bile, and in her arms she carried a swaddled babe. But no matter how she pressed the babe against her breast, it would not begin to drink, for the babe's eyes were milky, and the swaddling was heavy with yellow corpse wax. A mantle of fungus grew from the child's head and her shoulders. A corpse, unable to be blessed by living infection, and a most miserly thing to behold. A weeping sister, a daughter of the father of flies, who mourned for all those lost to dreadful death, who would never again feel the blessing of wondrous life coursing through their veins and innards and about their skin. She stumbled forth in despair, but the child is not what she wept for. Each step brought with it the life that fed on death, and the cold, wet rot that it thrived within. And such was the domain the daemon brought with her. In near hysterics, she cried out, "All gone, all gone. The children of Cultus are dead and remain dead. Do you not see the tragedy?" The carrier hound growled but did not respond, having little patience for the cries. The scribe, provoked by the endless weeping he had already been forced to endure, saw an opportunity to shoo away a nuisance. The destiny of this world is of no great concern. All is within the accountings of fate. At this the hound snarled again. Within the accountings. A most critical pawn is dead, and you declare it within the accountings. The plans of your lord are crumbling. The scribe hummed, a sour note which wove souls into wax. Ever crumbling, ever growing. The plans of my lord are endless, and account for all things. Your lord understands this, I should hope. My lord is beginning to understand how useless his fellows are at waging war. This supposed alliance is a waste of our armies. The carrier hound paced back and forth in fury, flames catching about its tread and flaring briefly. It is not a war, the weeping sister wailed out. Collapsing to her knees and squeezing the swaddled corpse, she continued, "It is salvation, saving them from death with the blessings of my lord." Not causing it, the scribe dipped his quill in the ink of black ambitions once more and continued to write as he replied, "It is neither. It is neither. War implies equal foes. Salvation implies a stagnate outcome. It is a leashing of their paths and actions. Surely you understand the taming of beasts, carrier hound? Surely you understand the desire to change their fated deaths, weeping sister? Have faith. All is within the accountings of my lord. I fail to see how, in truth, the performance of your lord has been most lacking thus far." A critique carried on the winds, and all three daemons noticed at once, only after the words had been declared. A figure dressed in fine but simple wear emerged from the misty warp winds. The figure was dressed in black with hints of gold in his buckles and bracelets. His face was hidden behind a veil of ambiguity, perfectly plain and indistinguishable in a crowd of many unrecognizable among a host of others. He held to the reins of two other daemons, lesser in status to he, and tormented with piercings in their flesh and rods in their orifices. These smooth-skinned daemons were clad in unremarkable garments, and they were tied to an unrecognizable carriage upon which the figure who called out rode upon. The carriage was burdened with luggage and tools, all the things required for theatres to perform, and its wheels turned in any direction without road or track. A master of ceremonies, an arranger of affairs required for the performances of others, labouring plainly and without bringing attention to himself for his prince of pleasures. About him was the scent of spice and the waft of perfume, and such was the domain the demon brought with him. At his sight, the carrier hound growled, the weeping sister despaired, and the scribe of Tzeentch hoped he would leave immediately. The master of ceremonies gave a charming smile before continuing his words. Of course, no offence meant. It's natural to have mistakes pile up without competent staffing. Still, I'd say the current plans are quite impossible to go ahead with. An emergency alteration is required. The hound growled out, furious that he was in agreement with the newcomer, Daemon. The time allocated to the godlings of the anathema has been a waste. That stratagem is too wasteful to recover at this point. New prey must be located. The scribe nodded in agreement, happy that his fellows were able to see the benefits in change. A path had already been charted for this scenario. New plans are already drafted and are being distributed as we speak. I predict that your lords will be quite pleased with them." The weeping sister wailed again. "The godlings are lost, given up on. Poor babes, abandoned by the blessings. Will we not go to save them?" The carrier hound snarled at the uselessness. The scribe of Zinch sighed, having seen this outcome. The master of ceremonies gave a polite smile to conceal his amusement. Nodding, the master of ceremonies whipped his reins once, causing the lesser daemons to writhe and jolt in delighted sensation. "I'd only come by to greet my fellows. I'll need to get a move on to get things ready for the next stage, as my fellow masters of ceremonies are likely already working on, you understand?" The scribe nodded as he handed off the finished scroll to the carrier hound. The carrier hound, showing much restraint, delicately took the message with his teeth. The scroll was clutched in the mouth, already full of bones, looking quite out of place. Snarling and immediately bounding off, the carrier hound was soon out of sight. With a jaunty wave, the master of ceremonies faded into the warp beyond as well, leaving the scribe of Zinch and the weeping sister. He hoped she would go away. She kept wailing miserly, utterly bent on not changing her spot. He made a note to petition his lord for a change in position. In the most ancient histories of mankind, wars often lasted decades or generations with indecisive outcomes. Old grudges that linger in bloodlines and shape a nation for many years to follow. This was the form of war his old friend was most familiar with. With the onward pace of technology, war shifted its nature into one of rapid and total annihilation of the enemy. He who strikes first will win without question, provided the strike is powerful and devastating enough. The nations that can deploy their war assets quickest can choose what locations become battlefields, and if they deploy enough firepower, they can ensure victory before the enemy is able to muster their defenses properly. The advent of void travel added yet another dimension to warfare, that being one of orbital supremacy. Nations that were locked to planets were at the mercy of nations capable of sailing the stars. There was no contest. Nations without ships of sufficient offensive power were at the mercy of nations with such ships. Warships were the single most important military asset in the age of void travel. Without warships, nations were theory. With warships, nations were fact. Every world in local space incapable of producing warships could be brought into the fold of the Imperium with a single ship capable of basic artillery strikes. No ruler worth integrating would refuse to join a greater nation with such generous terms if the other option was the destruction of his cities. One hand with friendship, the other with death, and the choice was theirs. Most were of at least middling intellect and recognized the benefits to joining. The rest joined only after a single city was destroyed. Thanks to the so far accurate information of subject Malum Kaido, all worlds without orbital capacity in their nearby systems had been integrated and were now hard at work setting up all the industrial capacity the burgeoning Imperium would require. The primary wealth of these systems? Water and metal. Water for Terra. Metal to bring more and more of the defunct and ravaged ships located and brought back to the Jovian shipyards back to full operational capacity. This was well ahead of their predicted scheduling. Incredibly good fortune. He didn't trust it. Metal was simpler. He grunted as he tapped his staff on the ground before him, the custodians before him pushing open the heavy adamantium plates and allowing him to pass. His current escort had entirely too many thoughts dedicated to what he thought were clever rhymes. Annoying beyond belief. He kept moving deeping into the compound, ignoring each dimly lit doorway that led into a subchamber, the vast majority of which were filled with cogitators and data files, enough to fill warehouses entered each day, and that same number left each day. The most efficient an Imperium-wide central bureaucracy could be at the moment. This compound, built into one of the smaller mountains adjacent to the primary fortress of the Astronomicon, was the current headquarters of the Adeptus Administratum, central governing body of the fledgling Imperium. Its systems of organizing information were designed to become increasingly efficient at larger and larger scales, a requirement to prevent needing to transfer within the first 100 years of the Imperium's creation. The galaxy was a large place, and the paperwork required to properly regulate a galaxy was enormous. Even stripped down, as their system was, it was still a centralized system. Presently they took up a fraction of the mountain facility in overall volume. The overall facility, starting from the peak and going down to the historically attested sea level, essentially hollowed out the immensity of the grand rock. Many of the more permanent buildings on Terra had to be designed in this manner, habitation chambers under the bulwark of many feet of protective rock. The surface was still too passively hazardous for permanent habitation yet. That would change as they brought more water back to Terra. His old bones creaked in irritating manners as he continued deeper into the facility, passing row after row of doorways into side chambers currently abrim with orderlies and agents of the mass-recruited administratum. Just about everyone who could read and write not busy with other tasks were brought to a facility, trained for a week in their new duties and given quotas to fulfill. There was no time to micromanage their labors yet, not on his end at the very least. They were given a small boon. That book from the subject, Malum Caedo, Codex Administratum. It contained little Malcador did not already know, but even then nuggets of wisdom were found within the document, which he pilfered without shame. The true value of the tome was in how expertly it managed to simplify and explain the nuances of running a most efficient system for the layman reader. It was carefully edited to remove more potentially problematic passages, then copied en masse, then handed out to each and every member of the administratum. The aforementioned passages were preserved and accessible with the appropriate paperwork fulfilled beforehand. Not technically forbidden, but adding a single layer of effort required to access the information was often more than enough to prevent the vast majority of humans from ever laying eyes upon it. Humans were slothful creatures that way. The Codex was a great boon, as was the simple tome of current languages. The last Codex was far more concerning, as it was useful, as it was infuriating that he knew the great ape didn't bother to read it before he left. Yes, the language is very dry and technical. No, that does not give you an excuse, you overgrown barbarian monkey. This was information on the great enemy, and you, Malcador's free hand curled in fury, and he ground his teeth as he kept walking. The Imperium would crumble in a day if all its citizens knew how absent-minded their emperor was at times. It was all he could do to ensure it ran smoothly in the cracks left by his friend's ham-fisted approach to life. Fortunately, his friend had listened to him more often than not, and had produced at least one agent that he could rely upon. He reached a door. It was not the final door in the row, nor was it a door of particular note. It was indeed a perfectly average door, identical to all others he had passed before. Door number 180. He knocked against it twice, leaving exactly 1/4 second between each knock, looking to the world at large as if he had simply rapped it impatiently. A hidden camera in the upper vents behind his head was looked through. A mind slowly touched his. He returned the gesture with the sending of a specific memory, the image of a two-headed snake. He grunted as the door was opened, and he entered into the unassuming chamber. Inside was a room like many others. Rows of cogitators, stacks of data files, wires connecting to power lines and broadcasting ports, and a single haggard-looking individual inside. A woman with shock-white hair that hung over where one eye should be. The woman in the same unassuming brown robes of any member of the administratum, and currently staring at him with her single turquoise eye. The most notable features were her lack of scars and the fact that she was 8 feet tall. To those who knew more than surface-level observation could bring, she was also exactly 10 years old. Officially, she did not exist. Unofficially, she was the 20th primarch, created by the Emperor of Mankind, left in his care to raise and tutor as his wild friend crusaded across the stars to retrieve the others. He deliberately did not think of her name. Her last test to prove she had mastered intrusive telepathy was to pry it from his thoughts without his notice. Lord of Terra. She respectfully ground out, irritation carefully hidden behind a blank gaze. She nursed no small amount of resentment for him, something he had deliberately instilled. Should the day come that he himself becomes a threat to the Imperium, she wouldn't hesitate to act due to emotional bonds, not like he did. She did not like him. That was safer for the Imperium at large. He needed more checks to his power than just his friend, and she would serve that role more than adequately. A new task for you, Agent 20. He grumbled, stumbling forwards and pulling a data slate from his inner robes. She visibly twitched in fury, gesturing wildly at the many slates already around her. He sneered in disdain. She had a tremendously poor habit of attempting to do too much herself. She needed to learn to actually use her agents more effectively. You have officers for a reason, girl. Delegate? This takes higher priority. She hissed as she took the data slate from his withered hands, noticing the slight twitching in his hands. Quickly scanning through the document, she jerked her head up and snarled in panic and fury. Again. Why wasn't I informed? He gave her a withering look, and she swallowed, grimacing, as she realized that her likely reaction was indeed the reason. She quickly got back to reading over the document, stress in her mind escalating with each passing line. The stockpile of 3rd Legion Genicide, the raw genetic material required to replenish their losses, had been stolen. This was indeed the second attempted theft. The first attempted threat had been forced back with great trouble, an old daemon that had fled from his friend in years past. Of course, the things that flee from the Emperor of Mankind are often much more of a danger to everything else, including their standard forces and a young primarch. He had been overseeing a transfer of the stockpile to a more secure facility elsewhere on Luna, in the quiet and unassuming manner best used for delicate matters. Unfortunately, quiet and unassuming didn't account for giant blackened skeletons made of metal breaching all defenses in an instant and breaking his goddamn ribs before slipping away in a flash of green light. It was not an immediate issue, so long as his friend did indeed manage to retrieve Primarch 3. He could simply move the half of 3rd Legion that was still on Terra to non-frontline roles and wait for the main Imperial fleet to return. He took deep and slow breaths so as to not aggravate his barely healed bones, even with his great expertise in biomancy. Restoring ribs from powder was not something he had great amounts of experience in. Some experience, yes, not much, however. Apparently he needed to correct that little oversight when he found the time. She growled, raising the tablet up to her face and clearly resisting the urge to shatter it in her hands before setting it down again. Yet another unforeseen threat, right? Her voice was cold and sharp, expectant, still sore over him, not wanting her worried about daemons quite so early then. Troublesome girl. Yes, actually. He growled out, looming over her seated form with the bulk of his psychic might to emphasize the point. A threat that I have no profile for I did not know of it beforehand. Hence why I am here. She wrapped her fingers against her arms in thought, before grunting out. The metal description matches several records of ancient pylon architecture. There was depictions of anthropomorphic figures on those at times. There was an anthropomorphic figure that punted me through a transport ship. He shook his head briefly, ignoring the flash of pain. I'm dictating a new task for you. You will be responsible for the creation of profiles on all threats of greater than planetary scale we encounter. Do this in addition to your pet projects with the scattered cultists. Delegate everything else to your Astartes. That's what they exist for. They don't know, she began, pushing up and slamming hands on the table. His glare and exertion of psychic will stopped her in place. Her soul buckled and writhed in his grip, but his hand-shaped soul did not allow her any freedom. She began to choke, then teach them. He let go. She almost collapsed to the floor, catching herself on her desk. Breathing deeply, she curled her hands into fists, which scored grooves in the plastic table. You should have been able to shake off that hold if you are properly rested. He drawled. You are not. I have work to do. She attempted, like looking into a mirror. You cannot be everywhere at once. You cannot do everything at once. It was a lesson that he should have learned long before he actually did. The ability to trust in others was a difficult thing to grasp, especially when your own abilities far outstripped theirs. She was quiet for a long time, glaring down and deliberately not looking at him. Eventually, she quietly spat out, "I understand." He huffed out. "Good then. Now, a final matter." He retrieved another item from his inner robes and held it out. She took a moment to look up, seeing his outstretched hand and the item it contained. A puzzled look growing on her face, she rose back to her full height and took the item, bringing it up to her face to examine closer. "A false eye?" she questioned. "Why not simply restore my old one with cloned tissue? A relic from before the age of strife." He explained simply, memories flashing as he remembered the simply decorated lockbox he had pulled the eye from. It wasn't anything more than a memento now anyways, it didn't matter. Once these optics were standard issue for cognition workers, you should find it making your labor simpler. She frowned, turning her gaze back to him. Why wait so long to give it to me then? She was looking for another test or lesson. There was none this time, however. Today is your birthday, girl, he impassively explained. She was quiet at that, turning the optic over in her fingers a few times in consideration. Slowly she brought it up to the socket hidden behind the curtain of hair that covered that side of her face, and slipped it into space, where the Medicae had to dig the ruined orb out last time. Does it function? Does it function? He grunted out, yes. She replied with an equal grunt. It established a psi link. He nodded in confirmation before turning and opening the chamber doors again. No need for more words. She knew her duties and had been taught a new lesson. He had to get back to overseeing the training of the first batch of assassins. Thank you, she called out plainly. He grunted before leaving the room and closing the door behind him. Girl was still too sentimental then. As he began to walk away, he considered the next matters he would need to personally oversee later on. The asteroid harvesting operations were still going strong, beginning to move onto near-Sol planetoids so as to not take too much gravitational mass from their own asteroid belt. That was the primary source of metal currently being used. Much of the closest such planetoids had already been completely devoured by cultist forgecraft to build that great big monstrosity his friend named after a horse. Atrocious naming sense. Next was the matter of arranging the unloading of the next water shipment. It would be some time before a standardized currency could be implemented, so most payments from integrated worlds to the Imperium, in exchange for the supplies needed to get their industrial bases up to standards, was in raw supplies. One of those raw supplies being water. How did that sorcerer warlord even get his hands on a vortex torpedo? It took the Emperor and him nearly half a century to close that warp rift, and now half the ocean was gone and the other half was too salty to support life. Blasted sorcerers and their ruining of everything for everyone else. He hated sorcerers. He deliberately ignored the irony of that thought as he walked through the halls of a grand mountain fortress, leaning on his arcane staff, which burned with psychic fire, wearing robes and escorted by a Gina soldier. Instead, he busied his thoughts with the much more comfortable state of internally monologuing about all the things that he had a grudge against, and why those things should be killed with prejudice. Bad enough that there were human sorcerers, or xeno-sorcerers, but now there were also apparently machine sorcerers who liked to steal cargo loads of gene seed. From what he could tell, that machine was also xeno in origin, meaning it was a xeno-machine sorcerer. All the things he hates most in a single entity. He was going to strangle it next time. Strangle it after punting it through a few ships and seeing how it liked it. He would figure out how to make the strangulation affect a machine later on, once he was in less pain. Her last memories before laying down to slumber, to rest through the troubles and be awoken at a safer time, were ones of red and white. Red for the capital, white for her, and Volish black for everything around her. Blooms of fire and sound, screams and roars, the clashing of bone blade and humming steel, torrents of warp energy and laser fire cutting through armor and flesh and kin. The greatest heroes and champions among the monkey, once allies against the Ignea, had been driven into war against the Eld. She did not know why. They did not tell her. All she knew is that the world was painted in pinkish hues. All she knew is that she could hear their roars as they feasted on sorceries and stamped on cream cities. All she knew is that their noble war cries were far more fearsome when they were aimed at elden fortresses. She was the Everqueen, however. If she did not have hope, what hope would her kin have? So she maintained the unshakable gold white as she laid down to rest, to await a new awakening. She awoke in a dimly lit chamber, the sea of souls like the heavy rock above her head, protectively curled around her slumbering form. She awoke with a little monstrosity near her, shivering, cold with hostile intent and in need of gentle warmth. She awoke with a taller godling, almost but not quite, eld in nature, soul like weathered marble, held together with bands of Asuriani gold and smouldering with Kaini red. She awoke with two of her kin, born starving and stunted, looking at her with desperate adoration. She awoke 2 or 3 lan along the off-white road. A vision so terrible that she longed to still be in the depths of gentle slumber. Their noble pantheon devoured by a newborn calamity. Their war god, even as dreadful as he was, shattered. Their jester fled, running headlong into deep dragon lines and pulling nascent strings of Morai He, their mother and her greater part imprisoned and tormented by the grandest perversion itself. Her people had lost her, forgotten her, and moved on. They had built wonders and terrors. They had yoked the wheel and all things therein, and slipped onto the false road of ever-escalating sensation. Blinded and ignorant of their pasts, her people had carved their annihilation and were now prey to ancient foes once more. She had wept for many weeks, a mourning tune to songcraft, a shoddy harp, and delicate fingers plucking at strings until she had shed a lake of snowflake tears, sequestering herself to unfamiliar chambers and letting her grief song paint the world and system in blue. A terrible shame came upon her after her grief song was finished, wasting a half-cycle on sorrow, forcing her kin of his age and their allies to shelter her within wings of wraiths, aided by songs of gold and red, against waves of off-green and fuchsia. She had barely the reserves to notice. She had barely the strength to offer deepest apologies. Her little kin did not allow her to, youngling warriors insistent on throwing themselves at her disposal, youngling maidens and youngling smiths doing similar. The youngling king on court at Charnax, Asar Nil. The Stonebank Lover was his name, a strange divergence from the name she once knew. He insisted that all her needs were met, and only permitted visitors once she declared herself ready for them. Clad in nostalgic pelts of beast hide, and crowned in starry bone. Months of greeting her little kin, white and grey, painting their forms as they desperately attempted to assure themselves she was real. It was much more difficult to keep faith than she ever remembered it being. But she kept it the same. She pulled herself up from her grief song and demanded the sunshine eternal over her waves. She demanded it, her soul obeyed, and her gold-white path through the dark seas was set. Truth was only what you allowed it to be. Her truth was that each day would be brighter than the previous. I apologize if the accommodations are not up to standard. The godling boy spoke, gentle smile and furrowed brows on his almost elden face. It was a little too uffish, but very close. He was clad in strange half-crook and half-eld plate, a product of the current day, and carried arms of primitive laser fire. His name was another strange corruption of word-song, indicating deep wilderness, Roban Ututia, although perhaps not inaccurate. It was something she would have to get used to, all the strangeness of the names of this era. Perhaps she could practice her kennings. That would be quite lovely. The boy already had many heaped upon him by her little kin. She could add cuter ones to the pile. Avail thyself, son of warm seas. Not quite. She smiled gently, moving to step through the dragon gate and onto the godling boy's capital world. It was delightfully charming. Green rolling hills, and little folk abound, going about in industrious fashion. The primary keep was cream and adorned in banners, and the sense of life were thick here. We shan't demand the accommodations of ages past on visitation such as this. Although, she leaned in slightly, hand raised to her face to act the silver expression out, we must confess it's a little overwhelming how much our little kin attempt to give. This is still quite refreshing yet. The slightly chastised shuffling of her rainbow-cloaked guardians, pulled from the most veteran and red-armed soldiers of each and every exodite world, conveyed embarrassment on behalf of their people. They had witnessed firsthand how much she was covered in luxuries, and how little she knew how to use any of them. Godling boy nodded in a slightly relieved manner, flanked by little kin Jewel, daughter, and his own personal guard. She had heard them referred to as star victors and thundering, warriors both, although she had been told neither were quite accurate. Broad-shouldered in ways that Eld were never more similar in stance to the proud monkey or croak of old, clad in wise bronzes and fiery reds, they certainly made entertainingly crass songs as they walked. My sisters should be present by last communication. I shall have food and drink prepared as you speak with them. Godling boy mused aloud. She reached down to lift the hem of her dress slightly, as was proper for young ladies to do, and stepped onto wrought stone ground. I did not send word ahead, as you requested. I should imagine they'll be delighted to see you again. The godling boy's sisters were marvelous from her memories, although she had been buried under pale blue at the time, and could not appreciate their habits. They had strange names as well. To tell on behalf of Pet Ra, Above Shield Kase, Sander Daylight Threads Ore, Lear Lord of Snarling Darknesses More, Rig Gone. Many uncute names for such charming girls. She would have to give them more appropriate friend names. That would be lovely, young Mernil. She smiled as she proceeded along. He was confused, but kept his polite smile on his face. Miriel, Jewel Daughter, had her face erupt in light reds and ears twitch as she heard and understood the name. Mernil, Jewel Lover. She let a wide and bright smile fill her face as she subtly teased her little kin. That was an exceptionally cute name. She would remember it. She heard a grunt of irritation and heavy footfalls on the other side of the door. Gently bringing her hand back down to her waist, she smiled as she waited for the most charmingly uffish godling she had ever met before to open the doorway and greet her. Soon enough, the doorway was thrown open as the young godling turned a readied scowl on whatever was on the other side of the door. The godling girl was fully mature in form from what she knew of their people's age cycles, but her soul was bound in the exuberances of youth. It was easy to tell that she was young still. Scowling, the godling girl blinked, leaning back to observe her at the door and the guards in the hallway. Taking measure of the woman at her door, the godling girl with feathers in her hair grunted out in the same accent of her little kin. Everqueen? She was more confused than anything it seemed. Good, she hadn't made such a terrible impression on the godling girls as she feared she might have. Smiling, she performed a curtsy. We had felt the desire to socialize, if that is agreeable. Godling girl considered the request for a long moment, clearly hesitating to let her into the room, but also not wishing to shut the doorway in her face. Eventually, social decorum won out, and the young lady opened the door wide to allow her to step in. "It's messy," she grunted out, clearly ashamed of the many projects and papers scattered about her personal chambers. Stepping in and giving the room a glance over, the Everqueen gave a private smile to the young lady and replied, "We suspect our chambers would be far more so had we not the aid of our little kin." Raising a hand to act silver, she gave a theatrical whisper to Pet Ra. "We find ourselves most absent-minded and careless, sleeping as a babe and forgetting the placement of our utensils." The small frown lightened a tad, a great success on her part. Pet Ra had perhaps one of the most Vorlish souls the Evergreen had ever seen, filled with black temper and speckled in fearful spots of white. The girl was quite afraid of failure, afraid of disappointing Mernel most of all. It would be difficult to get her to open up wide enough to let the Everqueen shower her in affections. The Everqueen had a plan, however. We must admit a hidden agenda. She pretended to confess as she sat down, raising a hand to delicately cover her lower face in false shame. Pet Ra narrowed her eyes and was filled with immediate, hostile suspicion. The Everqueen continued to speak. "We are from an age long past, and much of modern workings are arcane to our sight. Dreadfully fearful of embarrassing ourselves before our little kin, we thought to ask a favor." Pet Ra, understanding the motivation deeply, slowly nodded as she took a seat opposite to her. Shuffling slightly, she confessed, "The artifice of this age, the craft of the materium. We know nothing of its working. Our focus was always on the workings of the immaterium. Would you be willing to speak to us at length on the subject?" Pet Ra blinked in slight surprise, considering the statement. Lilithan excitement warring with Volish bleakness. "What subject first?" "First," she slowly asked, pulled in as a fish on a line. "The power mail is completely foreign to our sensibilities. It reminds us of the old crock workings, the few examples of which we held in our museums, nothing like what the Eld used. We would like to learn of it." The Everqueen smiled as Pet Ra was won over in an instant, immediately glancing over to her technical manuals open on side tables and papers filled with notation. She had, of course, seen the tomes immediately upon entering and formulated her questioning around that subject. The subject that Pet Ra was already immensely interested in herself, from what she could tell. "I suppose I can talk about it." Shyly, cutely, the young lady began to retrieve documents and diagrams with a small scowl on her face. Delighted, a wonderful name came to her as she watched the young lady gather the papers and began to lecture on the workings of materium craft. Pengar Tamu, Pout, Smith. Heels gently tapping on the stone floor, she walked down the rows of tome shelves until she found her next bonding target. Smiling, she reached up to rap gently against the wooden frame, bringing attention to herself. Her guards were mostly arrayed around the door and halls, one standing at attention behind her shoulder. The godling girl brought her gaze up from the heavy tome in her hands and smiled widely when she laid eyes upon the Everqueen. Performing an immediate and most proper bow, the godling girl spoke. "Lady Everqueen, I wasn't expecting you to be here. Lord Asenil's wedding celebration doesn't start for another week." Smiling in turn, she gently stepped forwards and replied, "It is because there is another week before that we are here. We thought to amend our indisposed state with renewed relations. You were kind to us in our deep blue, so we seek to return that kindness." The smile was warm yellow, the soul behind the smile was filled with bronze. A fearsome combination. It's not a great worry. I sympathize with your situation. It must be quite stressful to wake up in such times as these." The youngest godling spoke, raising a hand to politely rest upon her cheek. "I don't hold it against you." "I don't hold it against you. We are gladdened to learn that. Now we seem to recall an inquisition that we failed to properly answer before. Would you wish to return to the subjects?" Oh, genuine excitement finally filled the warm eyes of the young lady. "Yes, I would like that a great deal. Should we, may I retrieve my utensils and papers? But of course, we have also prepared a tome for you should you wish for it." Walking over to the nearby table, piled with books and parchments and quills and ink, she allowed her escort to pull the chair out for her before lowering herself into it. Quickly, the young godling moved to clear the items on the table into neat rows off to the side and retrieve one quill, one inkpot, and one stack of parchment. Holding out a hand, her escort reached into his lovely purse and retrieved a handwritten tome, a diary of sorts, and an educational book in other ways. Sliding it over to the young lady, who took it into her hands and brushed fingers across the leather and gold bindings, bound by a kind young eld in Charnax. Honestly, what kind of name was Nape Vengeance? Charn. Brushing the thought aside, the Everqueen explained the book. A tome detailing all we know of my greater half, our role as Everqueen, our experiences with her. All things related to Isha that we are aware of. You expressed interest in her last we met, and all she could do was weep out songs of misery. How shameful of her. We couldn't manage to fit all we knew of our pantheon and living in those days, however. Not in the time we had to record such. Smiling at the girl, struggling with her desire to read the new trove of knowledge, she continued, "Which is why we shall be happy to discuss such at length, should you wish." "Yes." "Daylight," Threads almost shouted. Quickly she brought up a hand and coughed into it, pretending that she had something in her throat before trying again. "Yes, I would very much like that. Are you available at the moment?" "Yes, we shall be for another hour or two. What would you like us to speak on?" Living Waters was a title I found in many old books, but it doesn't seem to be in common use any longer. I was about to go ask the Well Singer when he found time again, but you are here now. Nodding, the Everqueen began to explain. Isha is the goddess of many things: life, healing, growth, fertility, nature, the harvest. Her oldest and most potent form, though, is that of water. Primordial waters are the origin of life on maiden worlds, from which the most basic things sprout from and develop. Seawater, of course, is not suitable for crop and drinking. Fresh water, and specifically flowing fresh water, is what must be used for this. For water that lives is water that supports life. Flowing water does not tolerate filth and miasma, the things that bring illness and parasitism. A running river cares not who comes to drink from it, predator or prey. It cares not for your failures or successes. It does not invoke judgment upon mortals. The living waters flow, and in flowing they wash away foul things. It is flowing waters, living waters that are most holy. They wash away impurity, filth, sickness, sins. Isha of living. Waters represents this. The inverse of still waters, dead waters, stagnant waters, to which Isha is anathema to. Bright, inquisitive bronze polished itself with whites and golds as the young godling listened to her tutelage. The Everqueen was delighted at the efficacy of her fishing. The bathes on Baston were in the fashion of eld bathes, a wonderful point of comfortable familiarity. The waters were drawn from a nearby river, heated with arcane materium devices, and filled an artificial hot spring with wonderfully cleansing waters. Hot and steaming, opening pores and washing away impurities in the gentle flow of the water. It was quite delightful. Resting within the waters, she waited for her next target to approach, something she had learned from brief glances into the white road before her. Her ear twitched as the next young godling slipped into the waters on the far end of the chamber, also seeking the comfort of the artificial springs and not knowing that the Ever-Queen was also within. Soon the godling rounded the corner and pushed past the steams, only to freeze as she encountered the Ever-Queen in the alcove next to the alcove that she normally visited. Letting her ears twitch visibly and slowly opening her eyes, she pretended to take in the newcomer for a moment before smiling gently. "Ah, are we in your favoured spot?" she asked, knowing she wasn't. "We can move, if you desireth." In the prickly manner that youth were prone to, but too proud to move away, the young godling replied, "No," before moving over to her desired spot and sinking almost completely under the waters. "We had thought to bathe for the evening meal. The warm waters do the body well," she explained, not looking at the young lady and potentially frightening her off. "Didn't know you were here." Lord of Snarling Darkness replied, a dreadfully uncute name she had been cursed with. The Ever-Queen would have to fix that in time. "Ah!" Acting bashfully, she raised a hand to her face. "We were hoping to make our visitation something of a surprise." The fanfare grows wearisome at times, bringing a shamed blush to our ears. Moments of comfortable silence are rarely found, it seems. Yeah. It's nice." The young lady slowly rose from the water, now letting her neck be revealed. She still wasn't looking at her, the skittish girl she was. "Do you mind if we trouble you, seeing the opportunity?" She spoke again, causing the girl to retreat slightly before the Ever-Queen continued. "It's easier to wash the back with aid. We shall be delighted to do the same for you." Kind eyes looked into nervous ones. The Ever-Queen let her ears sway in a friendly manner. Eventually the young godling spoke again. Very well. Moving over to her, the rest of their time in the hot baths was spent in relative silence. Relative, comfortable, relaxing silence. She would be able to approach the girl in other places now, not just here, where she was most at ease. An excellent first step in reeling her in. Oh, how about Briggle? That might be a cute friend name. Stepping through the halls, flanked by her escorts, she felt an ear twitch as the presence watching her white path finally began to move. Keeping her path straight and predictable to the young observer, they eventually met at an intersection about 15 paces from now, a future that had yet to happen. "What is your aim?" Sharp and judging eyes glared into her. The last sister of the godling boy. The Ever-Queen smiled, both in present and in the moment that was about to happen. "I'm feeling quite motherly. I wish to heap affection onto the cute little godlings I see," she replied in the moment to come. The white vision faded. She stepped into the intersection. The last godling was already there, staring at her with blank eyes. A moment passed. Casa Santa nodded in acceptance. Honesty won her over in a moment. The Ever-Queen was an excellent angler. He took solace in the truth that if his daughter had been utterly twisted by the taint of chaos, he would still be able to feel her soul. It would shine like a pitch-black star in a sea of rot and foulness, easily visible against this backdrop of wretched green. She was not visible. She was therefore not here. The star on his brow burned gold as his will was maintained on producing a great flame, enveloping the ships of his fleet. Waves of defilement crashed against the Geller fields, which flickered even at full power against the onslaught. Wherever they failed, his will carried the slack and annihilated all that attempted to approach. The men and women in the helm were shuddering in soul-deep disgust, staring down at a world that glowed with resplendent toxins. Most did not know the reasons, though the quick glances at the status of the Geller fields and the warp lenses told them more than what they needed to know. The world of Barbarous was utterly consumed by the foulness of chaos, by the daemon predators that lurk therein, by the twisting of false gods and loathsome parasites. He had never seen a calamity on this scale, nor of this magnitude. Warp storms are typically quite content to remain in the warp, only influencing the materium in subtle manners. The world of Barbarus had no barrier between immaterium and materium any longer, and a predominant song had taken root in its soil. He knew it was a theoretical possibility, but the sight was shocking all the same, even if the solution was as simple as it had always been. Run a sword through its heart. He needed to destroy it before it was allowed to spread further. The moment he stood from this chair, his ships would be on a timer. How long could they last before the Geller fields failed entirely? 2 days, perhaps. So he would assume a single day instead, and purge the world of chaos by the 24th hour. He summoned up a fraction of will and linked his mind to the internal communication systems. In broad and deep baritone, he rumbled out over the length and breadth of the helm chamber, and the hundreds of officers and crew therein, and the hundreds of thousands of auxiliary officers listening through intercoms. Look upon the face of the warp. Look upon the enemy of mankind. In all its grand malignance, know that lesser creatures name these things divinity. He paused for a moment, then continued. Know that they are merely monsters. Know that mankind shall deal with these monsters in the same manner we have dealt with any other enemy. Steel in hand, fire in heart. He paused for a brief moment, considering what weapons to call upon. Not virus, bombs. The world felt too closely aligned with such a thing for him to feel confident in its success. He preferred to leave the planet intact and usable in the future, so not cyclonic torpedoes. I am the Emperor of mankind. I sentence the planet Barbarus to exterminatus extremis, a mercy compared to its current state. Ready the atomic bombardment. Atomic weaponry was rather primitive for this day and age, but just as effective as it had always been. A salvo of several thousand standard-size missiles would likely prove effective while also getting rid of the blasted things taking up space in his ships. Several hours later, he stared rather nonplussed at the planet Barbarus, the surface of which should be reduced to atomic ash from the many thousands of atomics of hundreds of megatons of destructive force each, spread across the surface in a nice grid pattern. Instead, it was still there, the rippling surface of rot, being struck by the materium bombs and shuddering in the way thick sheets of blubber might, dissipating the force of impact into the surrounding warp with little lasting damage to the planet itself. He was not sure how much he accomplished with that, but at least he got rid of the relics in his storage. He rumbled out another declaration, ignoring the horrified reactions of those in the helm as the bombardment did not significantly damage the planet. It seems conventional tactics will not work. Ready all forces for deployment. I shall lead the battle, personally. My lord, came the shout of many. He was impressed they had the spine to actually speak up. Taking over for the rest, his second-in-command spoke out. Lord Emperor, the planet just resisted a salvo of weapons that could incinerate Terra itself. Is it not prudent to make tactical withdrawal? He raised his hand slightly, palm facing upwards. For the current moment, yes, it would be prudent to leave the area and come back another time with superior weaponry. For the latter moment, consider, if you would, the following. Pointing at the warp lenses, he spoke a line that chilled all who listened. We have been in the system for several hours. The radius of its influence has expanded 1/10 of 1%. It is currently strong enough to force our Geller fields to flicker on occasion. Letting his hand rest once more, he finished. Well, no. We are going to purge this planet immediately and rid ourselves of a much greater threat at a later date. Ready all forces for deployment and withdraw the fleet to the maximum range of the Imperial Teleportation Array. We shall proceed with the battle as follows. Barbarus was a planet transformed by foul songs. Its oceans rolled with sewage and pus. Its mountains wobbled and flexed as rotten cartilage. Its flora bloomed and died in moments, a cycle of rot and renewal that left a thick floor of death upon all surfaces. Skies rolled with newborn miasma, the stench of rot and clouds of bile-like dew wafting in belching breezes. A distant, haunting laughter echoing in the deep horizons. And crawling up from the deep places, countless hordes of crawling things came up to replace those annihilated by nuclear fire. In the thousands, in the millions, more and more than what the mortal eye could hope to discern emerging from canyons that bled red water and flexed like torn muscle. Continents heaving like the abdomen of a wounded beast, and a great cavernous maw that gnashed at the bottom of its seas of decay, tongue-lapping and tasting the filth that foamed out and around its torn mountain gums and towering tooth-peaks. In a crash of heavenly thunder, a massive man appeared in the skies above the most clear continent, clad in golden power mail of such immensity that it outweighed lighter tanks. Massive relic bolt cannons mounted on his lower forearms and blessed missile launchers carried on his back. One hand carried a sword, the other carried lightning. He was clad in gold, red and black. He bore 1,000 songs. In his heavy power mail he stood 11 cubits in height. 1,000,000 lesser voices cried out as they raced for the man, carrying songs of ruin and despair with them, eager to share their blessings and curses with the man, eager to incorporate his gold into their songs, eager to snuff out his light, terrified of his royalty. He paid them no heed and shut out their voices with a thought. The man wore a helm bearing the form of a horned skull, and a sun in miniature burned on his brow and about his head and behind his head like a crown and halo of resplendent gold. 2 circles that intersect as cogs may, and 1 point of focus. His armor was adorned in eagles and thunder, and the aquila was borne on his chest as a gilded standard. The man stood steady upon vapor and light, looked down upon the unclean world, and proclaimed judgment upon it. "I bring you fire." The hand holding lightning extended forth. The psychic amplifiers of the immense power mail burned to life, channeling his will and empowering it with arcane systems. In a place as this, the immaterium and materium were one in the same, and all could behold the truth of powers. Upon the world of Barbarous, a pillar of fire burned to life, spinning as a mighty arrow, and crashing down on the inland sea below. A great flame washed out, and all the little songs were burnt up, and the blood sea parted and boiled up, and the cartilage land was made into thick ash and solid soot. The pillar spread out as a wall of flame and struggled against the sea of rot about it. And in the wake of the pillar, following in a second burst of archaeotech lightning, an angel appeared over the hard ash and packed soot. The angel stood twice the height of a man, with wings of marble and a sword of salt, and blue flame travelled in his wake. In fury, the angel roared out, and a halo of fire appeared about its head, and songs of rot were drawn into the halo and burned as kindling. The rot weakened, the fire began to spread steadily across the surface, land beneath rendered unto ash. Greater songs of rot finally completed their ponderous pace across the land, and attempted to snuff out the flames. The angel crashed into the first great unclean one as a bolt of lightning, roaring with thunder and fire. "Oh, what rude visitors!" the chiefest rot rebirth song declared, voice echoing from its mountain throne many kilometers away. It rose up on gangrenous legs and began to stumble its way down the blubbery mountainside, bringing all that terrible racket and mess into our home. "Come now, surely you know that it's most impolite?" The man turned his gaze to the chiefest song and replied in a voice that carried over the void. Beachhead established. "Send forth my talons." In 1,000 cracks of relic lightning, men and women, demigods all, appeared in the center of the ashlands. Clad in heavy golden mail, carrying arms that crackled with lighting and guns that spat fire, they moved as pairs to fan out in a circle. The women had souls of void, which drank the songs about them and established materium where they walked. The men had bodies of bronze, and they shattered demons as they approached the expanding circle of fire. Gunlaves sung with murder strokes or belched beams of disintegrating light. Along the terrible horizon, great shifting masses began to writhe, and eyes bloomed to life to stare at the intruding gold. Delighted howls began to echo over the winds, and swarms of infesting vermin began to descend upon the light and fire and warriors. In response, the angel roared back, and plates of marble flesh began to unfold, revealing intersecting lines and swirling smokeless fire. In 4,000 more cracks of lightning, another wave of men and women appeared in the center of the ash fields. Thralls and bondsmen of the demigods, second-line soldiers dedicated to carrying ammo and spare arms for their lords. They quickly proceeded upwards, trusting their lords to shoot down all that approached, and handed off loaded secondary weapons with mastered ease. In each group of warrior thralls, one man reloaded the mighty gunglaves, while 2 more supported their lord with covering fire. Secondary arms and primary arms were exchanged again, and the demigods cut ruin into the next wave of laughing daemons. The cycle proceeded as such, following in the wake of the circle of flame and preventing anything from snuffing it out with bile or pus. In the air above, smashing between giant winged beasts, things near to but not quite bats and vultures that cried out spells of despair, as an azure comet, an angel roared out in hateful commandments. Each command synchronized with another blow which ruptured a daemon on its blade of salt and shattered the air with its wing beats. Os, theos, be, smote, be smote, e, smote, be, smote. The man clad in gold and names spoke out once more, voice like fire and smashing into tides of rot before they could wash over his forces. Front line established. Send forth my Astartes. In 10,000 cracks of lightning, mighty warriors clad in finest mail and wielding great weapons appeared in the center of the ashlands. They bore 20 banners, 500 warriors to each. The first of 100 planned waves of these superhuman warriors. The warriors proceeded forwards in mighty packs, following in the wake of the fire and demigods, and moving to support the front line with guns that shot beams of deflagrating heat and furious will in the face of world-consuming decay. They were lesser to the demigods in gold, but far, far greater in number, and in number they marched out to cast forth fire and cleanse the world they now tread upon. The center of the ashlands was now a constant storm of crackling technological lightning, each thundercrack bringing forth another 10,000 superhuman soldiers in heavy plate. Above their heads their emperor stood, aloft on beams of light, and hands held wide as he forced the firewall to burn over the lands. About him darted the angel, who shattered all that approached to attack him and devoured their song souls to feed his crystal flames, roaring in hateful commandments. The daemons grew greater and greater in scale as the battle proceeded, giants of vaguely animal form and bone, laughing merrily as their rotting limbs hauled them to the front lines of the firewalls, spitting bile and poison like gunfire and spreading limb-rotting sickness at any exposed joint or man struck too squarely. The ground rumbled and heaved. A massive worm burst forth from the ground underneath the hunting pack of Astartes, closer in scale to whales than any mundane creature, dragging itself forwards on thousands of rusted iron legs and hungrily devouring warriors in its gaping, torn maw. Some 200 died the moment it emerged. It swung its head about for a brief moment. A moment more was all the time it had to exist. An azure bolt crashed into the titanic creature, the angel ripping into the landworm with twin swords of salt and screaming flame. Its song died the moment its head was cleaved in quarters and ignited in dying blue. The angel's halo devoured it at that moment. The flame wall paused in its advance for a moment, the emperor flexing a fraction of his will to defend himself from the 100-fold rotrakes, unable to spread his imperial truth in that time. Another 100 superhumans died along the front lines in the time it took for the angel to return to his sentry post and allow the emperor to dedicate his full efforts to the flame once more. Most carried banners, a handful were clad in gold. Another final flash of archaeotech lightning, and the last of the 1 million Astartes finally stomped their plated feet onto the planet. Counting each and every wave, the emperor called out again. Front line reinforced. Send forth my war striders. Flashes of lightning, more massive than anything previous, erupted in the center of the ashlands. Hunchbacked giants of plasteel and adamantium crashed their feet onto the surface of the planet. Small at first, a mere 15 cubits, and carrying heavy autoguns, the giants strode forth and began to unleash targeted fire at the skies, advanced systems giving them immense accuracy as they began to clear the air of rot drakes and free up the angel for other duties. Giant bloated forms finally finished their lumbering stride towards the front lines, sweeping immense blades of rusted godsteel down at the soldiers of man. Jolly laughter echoed out as these blades made a mockery of lesser armor, twisting it into rust and dust, and the men who bore it into corpses and heaps. Demigods of gold leapt and spun, twisting around the majority of these swipes and carving great channels and flensing wounds into the rotten forms. Their thralls shot fire into these wounds. The Astartes pumped annihilating heat into these great daemons and their lessers, coordination allowing them greater killing power than their lesser weapons would suggest. The second wave of Warstriders appeared in lightning, following after their smaller brethren. 20 to 30 cubits in height now, and carrying heavy arms of thunderous applause and missiles upon their backs. Their bolts cast out, and immense giants were forced to stagger back at the weight of these blows, opening them up to greater wounds by the demigods and Astartes. The Warstriders cried out in knightly boasting, and their song joined the chorus of wrath that filled with ashlands, spreading them further still. In the distance, the rumbling earth revealed itself. It was not earth. It was a great shelled beast, and stared out with milky eyes and writhing claws. Each great shake was a colossal step forwards that brought the mountain-sized thing closer and closer. Its song joined the chorus, and a great tsunami of exhaustion washed over the battlefield. But the waters did not overcome the fire, and the flame continued its march against the sea. Another flash of lighting, greater still than anything previous, burst forth. Ever larger Warstriders appeared in the ashlands, clad in blue-white heraldry and songs of praise to the machines in their hearts. 30 cubits, then 55 cubits, then 75 cubits. Each great form carried greater and greater weaponry still, a legion of titans. The world shook and wobbled. The lord of this place, Rutigus the Rainmaker, a most favoured son of Nurgle, finished his march down from the mountains. He carried decay and rebirth in his hands and spread his arms in praise and love. Great laser fire from the Warstriders raced forwards, and waves of rot rose to shield him from their blows. Clouds of steaming bile heralded his arrival as ever more wretched water rose up to defend their loving master. Chiding, he called out with a ruined mouth that spilled maggots upon the earth. "Come now, can't you see, this is all very little of you? The blessings are freely given. You don't need to ask or stamp your feet." Raising his ever-dying staff high, the great bloated form began to weave a song of ruination. "Allow me to help you." The Lord was interrupted as a screaming angel crashed into him with nuclear blue flames. The angel forced Rutigus back for 1,000 cubits, inarticulate roars of endlessly burning fury calling out from his barely recognizable form of shifting marble innards and burning cerulean flesh. The sea itself rose up, mass pooling together in 1,000 tons of decaying poison, a shifting face almost seeming to appear. It rolled forwards in a roar of waterfalls and sizzle of acid, and all it touched died in pain. Barely, the first of its waves began to crest over the front lines of the ever-spreading flame. A crack of archaeotech lighting. An avatar of the machine god stepped forth, 270 cubits in height. A fortress cathedral built upon its hunched back, bristling with weaponry. Its right arm glowed hot, a beam of white, a horizontal tower, a wall of hot death. The rot sea was parted and boiled away, unable to reach the front line before being unmade by holy fire. The Emperor spoke, blazing like a sun in the sky of a world that welcomed no light. Imperator Titan deployed. "Go forth and purge. Send forth my auxilia." In the wake of an Imperator Warstrider, a walking fortress of annihilation, without peer, mere men followed with autoguns, munition plate, and faith in their Emperor. Barbarous shuddered, and for the first time it was not a merry one.